Yes, Ms. Richards.
So there's one further document on the topic of home therapy, looking at, again, at the national picture that I propose to put on screen, showing that it's HCDO 5015_092. This is the annual report for 1979 of UK HCDO's Home Therapy Working Party, authored by Dr. Jones, November 1979. And if we pick it up in the third paragraph, we can see it says this: the working parties had the opportunity of studying the interim results for home therapy and prophylaxis in the UK in 1978. 821 haemophilia A patients and 101 haemophilia B patients are now on home therapy. If patients in training are identified as suitable for home therapy are taken into account at the end of 1978, 976 haemophilia A patients were on or awaiting home therapy. This is 82% of the target predicted in 1975 to 6. In 1978, 18.4 million units of factor VIII were used for home therapy and prophylaxis, 77% of the predicted need of 23.8 million units. Mean use per patient per year in 1978 was 24,241 units. Although about half of blood product used still comes from, this is for commercial, I think that should be from commercial sources, a very welcome change has been a rise in the use of Elstree factor VIII from 1.02 million units in 1977 to 6.6 million units in 1978. Surprisingly, cryoprecipitate is still being used by some centres. So this is as at the end of 1979. 98 haemophilia A patients were reported as receiving prophylactic treatment in 1978, a rise from 63 patients in 1977. 101 haemophilia B patients were on home therapy or prophylaxis in 1978, mean factor IX usage being 19,166 units. 25 B patients were on prophylaxis. So that provides an overview of the national picture, both in terms of numbers of patients on home therapy, the proportion receiving prophylactic treatment, and the overall use of commercial concentrate, NHS concentrate, and some continued usage of cryoprecipitate for home therapy. Returning then to the specific treatments and products used in the Newcastle Centre, whether for home therapy or hospital treatment, we next have the 1983 returns. Showing HCDO 40/149_002, please. So we can see these are the annual returns for 1983 for Centre 140, Director Dr. Jones. Total number of haemophilia A patients treated in 1983, 117. 0 carriers treated, 10 von Willebrand's disease patients treated in 1983. And then we can see the figures. So for plasma, there's a tiny amount used in hospital for a von Willebrand's patient. And then cryoprecipitate, and we can see here the numbers have reduced drastically in terms of cryoprecipitate usage from the last return we looked at from 1976. Here, the total cryoprecipitate usage for haemophilia A patients is in hospital 167,446, and then there's a small amount, 18,000 odd, for von Willebrand's disease patients in hospital. The amount of NHS factor VIII concentrate represents a significant increase from the last available return that we looked at. So now the figure is 988,989 for NHS factor VIII concentrate used in hospital, but only a very small amount used for home treatment, 45,190. And then we can see 4 commercial concentrates being used in the course of 1983, propylate, factor VIII, coate, and Haemophil. Previously, the predominant product was Haemophil. That now makes a relatively modest contribution, 7,500 in hospital, 127,372 units for home treatment. The next, in terms of proportion, is factor 8, next smallest, 69,900 used in hospital, 151,980 used for home treatment. And then very substantial amounts of both propylate and coate used, predominantly for home treatment. So the figures for propylate, 251,550 used in hospital, 1.269 million used for home treatment, and for coate, 176,724 units in hospital, 1.206 million units used for home treatment. So we can see both more and different products being used that are commercial concentrates. And so whilst there is an increase in the use of NHS factor 8 concentrate from what has been seen previously, clearly commercial concentrates are still the predominant treatment used. There is also, perhaps we will just go over the page. We can see the usage there for patients with antibodies, NHS factor 8 used in hospital, 229,585 in the course of 1983. So the predominant treatment for patients with antibodies is NHS factor 8 and then NHS factor 9, 278,514, and 606,475 for home therapy for patients with antibodies. Unsurprisingly, in terms of haemophilia B, if we go on 2 further pages, we see the usage is almost entirely NHS factor 9. So there are 14 patients with haemophilia B treated in 1983, 104,438 units of NHS factor 9 in hospital, 116,090 used for home treatment, and then there is a patient with combined factor 8 and 9 deficiencies for whom there has been some usage of cryoprecipitate and fresh frozen plasma. The next document, just to complete the picture, shows us a record of Dr. Jones's views on the use of porcine products. So it's IPSN 5036_012, please, Seamus. This is a document we've looked at individual components of it for different clinicians and centres on a number of occasions. So current approaches to the treatment of inhibitor patients in the UK. It's dated the 2nd of November 1984. If we go to page 6, we see the author's description of the position in Newcastle. Royal Victoria Infirmary, Newcastle upon Tyne, Dr. Peter Jones. Newcastle have 11 inhibitor patients, 8 of whom are treated with human factor 8 and 3 with NHS factor 9, 2 on prophylactic home treatment. Dr. Jones considers porcine factor 8 the first choice if either of the above forms of treatment fails, and is relatively unconcerned about price, considering that in an emergency the cost can be justified. His greatest concern about using porcine factor 8 for a prolonged period is the development of resistance to the product, and then there's a further discussion about that. And then this section concludes, Dr. Jones currently holds a stock for clinical trial purposes, but in future would like to have a small stock on a sale or return basis. So it would seem that certainly by 1984, porcine factor 8 is not a significant part of the product usage policy in Newcastle. If we then, please, Seamus, go to BPLL 302848_001. This is a letter dated the 23rd of February 1988. So it's not, as we're directly contemporaneous, it's looking back over the previous few years, but it's obviously closer in time to any current statement that we have. And it was from Dr. Jones to Dr. Liam Donaldson, who was then the Regional Medical Officer at the Northern Regional Health Authority. And he says this: I enclose a historical record of the use of factor VIII preparations in the northern region since 1969. I hope this will help answer many of the questions raised by the Regional Health Authority and Jim Cousins. These figures, taken with my comments below, should allay any worries that the northern region's use of factor VIII has been in any way untoward. And then he, in the next paragraph, he says that he hopes that any questions relating to the management of haemophilia and incidence of HIV could be addressed directly to Dr. Jones and to no one else. And then figures presented both in tabular and graphic form. Table A lists the use of factor VIII preparations from 1969 to 1975. Between 69 and 74, the figures for Carlisle and Newcastle are incorporated. From 1975, the other associate centres in Sunderland, Middlesbrough and Whitehaven are included. Between 1969 and 1975, much of the service depended on the use of fresh frozen plasma. Commercial concentrates were introduced in 1973 and quickly made up the shortfall in local blood transfusion service plasma and cryo. The sudden rise in NHS factor VIII concentrate usage in 1971 was caused by the treatment of one patient who suddenly developed high titer factor VIII antibodies. And then Table B shows the use of factor VIII between 1976 and 1986. Most of the fresh frozen plasma in these years was used for the treatment of factor V deficiency. With the increasing use of home therapy and prophylaxis, cryoprecipitate usage declined over the years and until recently was only used for small children and mildly affected patients. The supply of NHS concentrate to the northern region has been, to say the least, erratic, and the inevitable growth shortfall has been made up with commercial concentrate. And then 3 paragraphs further down, within the past 6 years, we, that's in the northern region, I think, rather than just Newcastle, have been responsible for treating between 5% and 8% of UK haemophilia A patients. And then he asserts that the average per patient per year usage of factor VIII has been in accord with the rest of the country. Skipping over the next paragraph, he refers to figure 2 and the discrepant usage of NHS and commercial concentrates. I have already referred to the erratic supply of the former. He then goes on to deal with heat-treated products, and I'm going to come back to that tomorrow when I look in more detail at the introduction of heat-treated products in Newcastle. If we could go on, please, 4 pages, Seamus, to the tables. Sorry, could we go to the previous page, to Table A? My apologies. Now, we don't know precisely upon what data Dr. Jones based these tables, and it may be that we need to do some further work in that regard. But we can see that this is product usage in the Newcastle supra region, so including the other centres that Dr. Jones identified in the body of the letter, from 1969 to 1975. I'm not going to read through the figures for plasma. You can see them set out there. In terms of cryoprecipitate, we can see usage increasing overall from 270,000 in 1969 through to 977,000 in 1975. In 1972, the usage seems rather low, and it leaps then to 917,000 in 1973. But in any event, that's the increase in use of cryoprecipitate over this period. NHS concentrate, we can see almost no usage at all, with the exception of that 1 year, 1971, when very large quantities of NHS concentrate were used. And then we can see commercial concentrate introduced in 1973 and rapidly increasing from 133,000 units in the first year of usage to 972,000 units in the third year of usage. If we then go to Table B, please, Seamus, at the next page. I'm not, for present purposes, going to look at the comparison with the UK usage, although that may be an exercise that will need to be considered in due course. But just to look at what this tells us about Newcastle usage. So here we need to start from the bottom of the page, which it starts with 1976 and goes up to 1986. And if we look at the box headed Newcastle, we can see in 1976 the figure for cryoprecipitate is 676,050. And then that essentially reduces over the years. 1979, 452,000 units, 1980, only 67,000 units, 1981, 186,000 units, 1982, 35,000 units, 1983, 167,000 units, and so on, with a slight increase in 1986 to 205 units. But overall, a pattern of decrease in the use of cryoprecipitate over that period. In terms of NHS concentrate, again, working from the bottom, we see a relatively modest amount used in 1976, 82,800. And then really quite disparate figures in different years. So an increase to 1.677 million in 1977, 959,000 in 1978, 926,000 in 1979, drops down to 623,000 in 1980, climbs up to 1.439 million in 1981, drops down again to 980,000, and so on, and then a rapid reduction in the course of 1985, which no doubt reflects the introduction of heat-treated products. And then we can see the figures for commercial concentrate, which is by a very significant margin the main treatment recorded. So we can see 1976 the figure is 1.649 million. That increases the following year to 2.30 to 2,301,000. Then 3,672,000 in 1978. 4,356,000 in 1979. 3.5 million or thereabouts in 1980. 3,234,000 in 1981. 3.6 million in 1982, 3.26 million in 1983, 4.391 million in 1984, and then 6.4 million and 5.7 million 85 and 86. So the figures vary, but perhaps to a lesser extent, but clearly overall both a significant increase and the main product in use. And so that, in terms of the actual figures for units and assuming the reliability of the data recorded in these tables, fills in, as it were, the gaps between the annual returns that we currently have and the other documentation we currently have, to show the overall patterns of usage in the 1970s and in the 1980s. In terms of the mechanics of supply and the way in which decisions were taken and who had a role in decision-making in relation to treatment policies and product usage, there are just a few documents to look at and a few observations to make. We know both from what Dr. Jones has said in the various materials we've looked at and in a letter from the Newcastle Regional Transfusion Centre that whilst it would receive and supply BPL factor 8, commercial factor 8 did not pass through the Regional Transfusion Centre. It was obtained directly from the commercial companies by the Haemophilia Centre at the Royal Victoria Infirmary. And that's confirmed in a letter from the Regional Transfusion Centre in July of 1981. In terms of how decisions then were taken by the Haemophilia Centre as to what products to use, Dr. Jones's account in his statement is that there was an annual meeting which would involve him, a nursing staff member, a pharmacy staff member, and a patient representative who was usually the chair of the northern branch of the Haemophilia Society. Those meetings were not, he says, minuted. Dr. Jones would present information about safety, efficacy, availability, and price, and a decision would then be taken. Dr. Jones doesn't recall, he says, any major disagreements about product choice or any need for a deciding vote. And then products would be purchased through the hospital pharmacy at the Royal Victoria Infirmary. And if we go to, sorry, forgive me while I check a reference. PJON 5056_001. We can see from this an indication that price had a role to play potentially in terms of selection of commercial products. This is a memo dated the 3rd of February 1981 from the Area Pharmaceutical Officer of the Newcastle Area Health Authority. He sets out the expenditure incurred by the Regional Haemophilia Centre during the current financial year, and the figures I'm not proposing to go through. The total is said to be inclusive of the following products: Haemophil, Factor 8, Co8, Humanate, Profilate and Autoplex, so all of those being used in that financial year. And then he observes the ability to buy in bulk and to switch between brands has enabled a current price of around 7.2 pence per unit to be achieved. And so I should say nothing in the material that we've seen so far suggests the kind of brand or batch dedication policies that we've seen from some other centres, although it's right to note clearly that for a number of years Haemophil was the chosen product before the centre started using a range of different commercial products. It does not appear that the Regional Transfusion Centre had any significant role in decision making, and we can look at a draft statement from a consultant haematologist employed at the Regional Transfusion Centre. It is NHBT 001946. So you will see, sir, this is an unsigned and undated statement. Not sure whether there is available a signed or dated statement, but in any event, it's from Anne Collins, consultant haematologist employed by the Northern Regional Health Authority at the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre, Newcastle upon Tyne. And it was, I think, clearly prepared in the context of litigation, presumably the HIV haemophilia litigation. She explains in the second paragraph that she succeeded Dr. Murray as medical director at the Regional Blood Transfusion Service from September 1979. She sets out her belief that the general arrangements which were in force between the Haemophilia Centre and the Blood Transfusion Centre had been negotiated at some time in the past between Dr. Jones and others. The practice in 1979 was for commercial blood products for haemophiliac patients to be ordered by the pharmacy department at the Royal Victoria Infirmary. As far as I was aware, payment for commercial blood products was arranged for by the Regional Health Authority. At no point was the financing of the purchase of commercial blood products debited to the Blood Transfusion Service budget. And then she says the treatment of haemophiliac patients themselves was entirely a matter for Dr. Jones and his colleagues. Dr. Jones was responsible for the selection of a suitable commercial blood product. And then she talks about production of cryoprecipitate. She says in the 1970s, treatment of haemophiliacs was largely carried out with cryo and fresh frozen plasma. At this time, I was the senior registrar at the Blood Transfusion Service. Although it was sometimes a struggle because of the poor facilities we then had at Newcastle General Hospital, we usually managed to meet the demands of the Haemophilia Centre for cryoprecipitate and fresh frozen plasma. There was a gradual improvement in our facilities at Newcastle General Hospital prior to our transfer to the present purpose-built premises in September 1985. For example, whilst we were still at Newcastle General Hospital, a new laboratory was provided for the production of cryoprecipitate. And then she talks about how Dr. Jones became an advocate of home therapy for haemophiliacs at the bottom of the page. And then if we go over to the 4th page, please, Seamus. Last paragraph, she says this: although there was a shortfall in meeting the production targets for blood plasma by the Northern Regional Transfusion Centre, nevertheless, this did not appear adversely to affect the operation of the Haemophilia Centre in Newcastle upon Tyne. In particular, I recall writing to Dr. Jones as the director of the Haemophilia Centre in August 1983, informing him that there was a large supply of factor VIII from the Central Blood Products Laboratory, which was awaiting use at the Northern Regional Transfusion Centre. I recall I had previously spoken to nursing staff and to Dr. Jones about the existence of this surplus, and because there was no reaction to my conversations, I eventually wrote to Dr. Jones on the 26th of August 1983. It became apparent that there was a preference at the Haemophilia Centre for commercially produced factor VIII blood product for the following reasons. A, commercial factor VIII was more easily soluble. B, some patients tended to have allergic reactions to NHS-produced factor VIII. For example, some patients had shivering attacks, presumably because NHS factor VIII had more impurities. C, the presentation of commercial factor VIII was more attractive to the Haemophilia Centre. At that time, commercial factor VIII was sold with a bottle of water and a needle so that the dried factor VIII could be infused. So that was Dr. Collins' perspective as set out in this statement, that there was in truth a preference for commercial over NHS products at the Newcastle Centre. There is then just one other document with, again, an external observation on Dr. Jones's approach. Seamus, it is TYWE 40352 _001, please. This is a rather later letter. This is the 16th of September 1986. So we're now in the era of heat-treated products, which I'll be discussing tomorrow. It's a letter from the District General Manager of the Newcastle Health Authority to Dr. Liam Donaldson as Regional Medical Officer for the Northern Regional Health Authority. It's about the budget for haemophilia treatment. He refers to enclosing a point-by-point response, but then says this: you will, however, discern that one of our major difficulties lies in the exercise by Dr. Jones of clinical freedom. This is clearly an issue with which we must come to grips. In the meantime, of course, the probability is that we're again heading for a substantial overspending on anti-haemophilia products, and there is some urgency in clarifying our position with the RHA. So just picking up there that observation to Dr. Jones's exercise of clinical freedom. More broadly on issues relating to self-sufficiency and supplies, without going to the underlying documents, because we'll no doubt pick this up when we consider the position of the blood services in more detail at subsequent hearings, sir, there are communications in the course of 1975 between the Northern Regional Health Authority and the Department of Health and Social Security, considering the possibility of increased plasma production by the Regional Transfusion Service. We've detailed in paragraph 69 of the presentation note the references to the relevant correspondence. I'm not going to go to it now, but we can see that it resulted in the course of 1975 in a capital allocation and revenue allocation by the DHSS to enhance production. Picking that up 4 years later 5 years later in 1980, And just to see what the position was on a regional basis, if we go to DHSC 302201 _ 002, please, Shomik. We can see here a communication between the Northern Regional Health Authority and the Department of Health and Social Security. Again, I won't take you through the chain of correspondence, but we can see the second paragraph says, in this region we accept the introduction from the 1st of April 1981 of a policy of pro rata distribution from BPL. And then it goes on to say, we don't see any possibility of increasing plasma supplies from 1981 to 1982. The department is aware of the congested state of our present regional transfusion centre. A new centre is being planned, and when we have it in 5 or 6 years' time, we should be able to consider increasing our plasma supplies. And that position is reiterated some 18 months or so later. If we go to DHSC 302215 _ 023, so this is 20th of January 82, again a letter from the Northern Regional Health Authority to the DHSS. And we can see it says, we accept in principle, this is the second paragraph, the proposals for increasing the supply of fresh frozen plasma to BPL and the implications of this for planning of the new laboratory. We'll be considering the timescale for meeting our target, but I think it unlikely we can achieve this before we have our new regional transfusion centre in about 3 or 4 years' time. There was later documentation to suggest that the new regional transfusion centre opened in the course of 1985. So we can see there, on a regional level, potential constraints upon the ability of the regional transfusion service to up its sending of plasma to BPL. On a national level, Dr. Jones voiced views on the issue of self-sufficiency on a number of occasions. I'm going to show 3 of them. First of all, Shomik, sorry, forgive me, I need to find the reference first of all. It's a meeting, I don't have the reference recorded, it's a very short passage, I'm going to read it out and I'll supply the reference tomorrow. It's a UK HCDO Directors meeting on the 13th of November 1978, attended by Dr. Jones, and in the course of a discussion about supplies of concentrates, Dr. Jones is recorded as saying this. He felt strongly that the directors should set a new target for Factor VIII production for the Department of Health. 40 million units of Factor VIII was the target set in 1973. Almost 50 million units of Factor VIII was used in 1977, and only 17 million units of this material was British-made concentrate. This meant that the Department of Health was not yet halfway towards the earlier target which had been set. In view of the high cost of commercial material, he felt sure it was better to spend the money on the British fractionation plants rather than to continue to spend large sums of money in purchasing the foreign-made commercial concentrates. Thank you. Thanks, Rachel. I hope you have a reference for that now. HSOC 001 0549. And if that's right, it's page 14 of the document. Yes, thank you, that's great. So it's the bottom half of the page is the passage I read out. I'll just repeat the last sentence, in view of the high cost of commercial material, he, that's Dr. Jones, felt sure it was better to spend the money on the British fractionation plants rather than to continue to spend large sums of money in purchasing the foreign-made commercial concentrates. So that's a view expressed by Dr. Jones within the forum of the Haemophilia Centre Directors' meetings in 1978. More publicly, in journals, Dr. Jones expressed firm views on issues relating to self-sufficiency. So if we start with DHSC 303722_064, please. This is a article in the British Medical Journal, 21st of June 1980. It's entitled Factor Rate Supply and Demand. If we could zoom in on the bottom half of the page, please, Seamus. And I'll just, it ranges over a range of topics. So I'm just going to dip into a couple of passages. Middle column, second paragraph. At the end of 1978, because of a continuing shortfall in supply from the National Blood Transfusion Service, over 50% of factor VIII used in the UK for home therapy and haemophilia A was imported, a fact that should be of concern to all those who give blood regularly in the United Kingdom. And then he goes on to discuss the position in relation to Germany. And then over the page, if we go to the bottom half of the page, please, Shomik. It's the left-hand column. The second feature of the blood product market to cause concern is the use of plasma obtained from donors in developing countries. That this practice can be excused by arguing that the purchase of plasma increases the standard of living of the donors concerned is fallacious because it hinders the World Health Organization's policy of encouraging the development of self-sufficiency in these countries. In addition to the widely publicized example of Nicaragua, I have been told of recent plasmapheresis for export in Belize, Brazil, Colombia, Haiti, Korea, Lesotho, Mexico, Panama, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Thailand and Taiwan. In these countries, only the Travenol Center in Puerto Rico and that run by the Belize Pharmaceuticals Company Limited come under the US Food and Drug Administration regulations. To my knowledge, no single manufacturer of commercial plasma products is yet self-sufficient in terms of source material, all companies being reliant on plasma brokers to some extent. Within the US, excellent facilities exist for the collection of, and if we can go to the top of the next page, top of the plasma, and what brokerage occurs is carefully monitored to comply with strict FDA rules. What happens outside the areas of FDA surveillance is anyone's guess. Many people in this country, including my own patients, have every reason to be grateful for the generosity of donors in other countries and for the skill of FDA-supervised fractionators. However, I believe that it would be wrong for the Department of Health to extend its present dependence on industry at the expense of more direct involvement with blood collection from unpaid voluntary donors. Higher prices for blood products would result. It's no coincidence that the price of factor VIII is lower in the UK and higher in West Germany than in most other European countries. And the eventual destruction of one of the only remaining totally voluntary blood donation services left in the world would follow. I think that my colleagues in the National Blood Transfusion Service would agree that our previous failure to become self-sufficient should be reversed. But it must be realised that nothing can be achieved without considerable changes in our organisation for the collection and processing of blood and in our attitudes to its optimum use. It will not be enough for government to emulate the platitudes expressed by the Secretary of State at the DHSS in 1976, when we were told that self-sufficiency was expected in mid-1977. On that occasion, Dr. David Owen said, according to the DHSS press release, blood voluntarily and freely given by the healthy to those in need is a manifestation of the values which we should all strive to maintain in society. If members of the present government concur with this view, they should be prepared to fund the changes and to support actively both voluntary blood collection and centralised and efficient management for plasma fractionation. And you can see the author there by Dr. Jones. So that's in mid-1980. Those are the fairly trenchant views expressed by Dr. Jones on the issue of self-sufficiency and government funding. And then there is one further article from 1985 on a similar topic, Haemophilia HSOC 302441. This is a document authored by Dr. Jones in September of 1985. I don't propose to go through all of it, but just to a handful of passages. It starts, blood is one of the most dangerous remedies in the clinician's armoury. Those who take it and process it regard it principally as a precious biological fluid and look to the conservation of its donors. Those in commerce, because of it, regard it as a commodity, obeying the same laws of supply and demand as other commodities and look to conserve their products. Those who use it principally as a medicament with which to conserve, those who use it regard it principally as a medicament with which to conserve their patients. And then the very bottom of the page, Dr. Jones refers to an exchange of correspondence published in the BMJ in August of 1985. And if we go over the page, he says in the first paragraph, referring to his response in the BMJ, I said that the United Kingdom had had the medical resources and technical expertise to create a modern and truly national transfusion service in the early 1970s, but that it had lacked leadership and honest financial backing instead of humbug from government. The result was that the goal of self-sufficiency mouthed by politicians and senior doctors for over a decade had only been achieved recently for the fairly small population of 5 million people in Scotland. And then he refers, bottom of the page, the last paragraph, in the early 70s, I was privileged as a young consultant to sit in on discussions between members of the National Blood Transfusion Service, Haemophilia Centre directors and members of the Department of Health, and can well remember the frustration that we as clinicians had in trying to convince our colleagues of the need to supply us with sufficient factor VIII from the volunteer sector to allow us to provide adequate treatment for the haemophilic families in our care. We met with resistance from almost everybody in authority, despite cogent arguments put forward by Dr. Rosemary Biggs and her colleagues. And he goes on to detail what he says clinicians were told. And then, bottom of the page, as a measure of our failure to convince our colleagues that lyophilized factor VIII and IX products were necessary for the alleviation of suffering in haemophilic patient families, government allowed the importation of commercial products obtained from the blood of paid donors for the first time in 1973. The results of these imports were as dramatic as the introduction of cryoprecipitate had been in the mid to late 60s. Home therapy programs were started, and the umbilical cord, which until then bound haemophilic families to hospital for every facet of their treatment and care, could at last be severed. The management of haemophilic within the United Kingdom started to equate with the management of the disorder in the USA and other European countries. It was at this stage that both the service and government made the fatal mistake of relaxing their drive for self-sufficiency. It was far easier to pay £2 million or so revenue a year for these products than it was to put capital into the revamping of Elstree and the provision of modern equipment and increased levels of staffing in the regional transfusion centres. And so the article, I'm not sure whether it was published or not, so the document continues. So a flavour there of Dr. Jones's views in relation to failures of government to achieve self-sufficiency, which, sir, you'll no doubt wish to consider as against the evidence showing the substantial use of commercial concentrates by Dr. Jones at the Newcastle Centre. So I note the time. I'm not going to finish the next part of what I want to look at speedily, so it may be wiser to pick it up in the morning, but I'm in your hands.
Well, let's do that. So 10 o'clock.
Yes, sir.
10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.